Today is Wednesday, January 23rd, 2008. My name is Joel Gordon, Emeritus Professor of Physics and Stone Professor in Natural Sciences. This morning, as part of an Amherst Oral History project, Lucy Wilson Benson and life about her long and distinguished career. Lucy has a list of achievements and honors that is much too long to detail in full, but I want to mention that of her many offices of high authority, there are included the National Presidency of the League of Women Voters. She was Secretary of Human Services for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts under Governor Dukakis, and she was the Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science and Technology under President Jimmy Carter. She was the first woman to occupy the latter two offices, and she was also the first woman to serve on a number of boards or as trustee of colleges, philanthropic organizations, and corporate boards. Lucy's also been an active member of Amherst College. She was also the devoted wife of Bruce Benson, Amherst class of 43, and a member of Amherst's physics faculty from 1947 until his death. She and Bruce were very generous benefactors of the college, a generosity that includes endowing the Bruce B. Benson 43 and Lucy Wilson Benson Professorship, a chair currently occupied by Professor Canon Jagannathan of the Physics Department. Lucy, let's begin early in your career and in your life. You were a graduate of Smith College, and like many Smith colleges, your initial trajectory after college was somewhat typical. You went to New York, I believe, and from there to New York, and then back to Western Massachusetts to Amherst, where you married an Amherst graduate.
That's right.
Tell us a little more about those early years.
Well, I actually met Bruce when I was a senior at Smith, and he was on the faculty, of course. And then I went off to New York when I graduated to work for a while, but I didn't stay in New York very long because we were married within the year and moved to Amherst in March of 1950, and been here ever since.
You've told me somewhat earlier a little bit about your first impressions of Bruce,
Oh, dear.
and how I think they deviated from later ones.
Oh, well, indeed. Yes, our first date was sort of semi-arranged by a member of the history department at Amherst College who was a friend of my sister. They had been graduate students together in American history at Harvard. And Mel Kranzberg called and asked me if I would contemplate going out with Bruce. I was initially a little bit timid about that because of physics. I had no knowledge, still don't have very much knowledge of physics. And anyway, we went out, and Bruce came over to Smith College to get me one evening. We were going to go to the movies, and but it was pouring rain, and he came into Haven House where I lived, and with an old hat and really quite a disreputable-looking raincoat, and his trousers were too short, and I thought, oh my God, what is this? But I went out with him, and we had sort of a funny first date, but the second date was infinitely better, and from then on, it was just one thing after another.
And one thing after another included marrying him in
Oh, well,
1950,
seeing him during that summer and fall. I went to Europe that summer, and he met me when I came back, met me at the boat in New York, and the Queen Mary, I think it was, or maybe it was the Queen Elizabeth, I forget now. So I saw a lot of him that fall, and then we got engaged about, I think, Thanksgiving time, and got married the following March of 1950.
And then in those first early years as an Amherst spouse, what was it like?
Well, it was, I don't really remember it too well. It was sort of odd because the faculty wives had a sort of life of their own, but I had a job at Smith College, and so I didn't become a part of that. Ladies of Amherst, they were called, and I worked at Smith College, and I went to Smith every day, and 3 years later, I became a graduate student in history at Smith. So for the first 5 or 6 years, I was very busy, either working or being a graduate student.
So you weren't a member of that club of the ladies of Amherst that used to sew costumes for Kirby Theater
Well,
performances?
that's one thing the ladies of Amherst did, but I don't think every member of the faculty, every faculty wife knew how to sew. I certainly didn't. But I think one was automatically a member of the ladies of Amherst. I don't seem to remember that, but I just didn't go to the meetings because I was working, and they met during the day, in the afternoons, I think.
And then some 3 or 4 years after you came to Amherst, you became active in the League of Women Voters?
Well, I think it was. I think it was about 1954 or so, or 55. I was dragooned into joining the League of Women Voters, which I had no intention of doing, by other faculty wives. Joy Kennedy was the wife of Gail Kennedy in the philosophy department, and Frances Warren, whose husband Colston Warren was in the economics department and the editor of Consumer Reports. And once I got involved in the league, it was terribly interesting, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon I was league president and on the state board, and then state president, and then eventually a national president.
Ooh, you've leaped ahead a little too quickly for me. I wanted just to interpolate that Gail Kennedy is prominent in the history of the college.
Indeed.
He was
The new curriculum.
of the new curriculum.
Yeah, and then I also worked for George Taylor, who was also involved in the new curriculum. George Taylor in the economics department. He was also professor of American Studies, and I read papers for him one semester, but I was too tough on the students. He had to go and reread them all. So he told Bruce.
Now, just to digress from your career for a moment, the new curriculum, which 40 or 50 years later we still refer to sometimes as the new curriculum, was the curriculum which distinguished itself in the United States as being probably the only one in which all entering students were required to take a science and math course, a math and physics course in their first year, as well as the famous English 1-2 course.
Right.
Bruce must have participated in that course
Indeed,
almost
yes.
from the beginning.
Yes, he was involved in it from the beginning, and he was strongly approved of it, and a lot of faculty did not approve of it, and it eventually was discontinued, which was too bad. I thought it was an excellent idea. Not being a scientist myself and not having ever taken physics, which I wish I had been forced to take, as Amherst College students were, I think it was an excellent thing to go into this world without understanding basic physics. It seems to me is a big mistake. So I was sorry when it got done in.
So was I. I wasn't here then. It's my understanding that when that course began, Ted Soller, who was then chairman of the department, was the lead professor of the course in the Science 1-2 part.
Yes, I'm sure he was. Yes, yeah.
And my understanding also is that he rapidly recognized that that was not his forte.
Ted Soller.
Yes.
I'm not sure. I don't know about that.
And that at Ted's initiative, we went out and recruited the famed Arnold Ahrens.
Right, yes.
Do you have any recollection of the early years when Arnold first arrived at Amherst? And
Well, Arnold
Bruce's
was,
reaction?
Anybody who knew Arnold would recognize immediately he was a kind of explosive personality and a very tough guy, and a tough disciplinarian, I think, and a very good teacher was what I heard. He was an interesting man, and hard to say. He was a very interesting person and a very good teacher, but he also was cordially disliked by a great many people because he was so tough. And a lot of students didn't like having to take physics. But in later years, I've talked to people who were students at that time. They sort of think back on Physics 1, or it was Science 1. What was it called?
Science 1-2.
Science 1-2.
Right.
Fondly. Oh, I had your husband in Science 1-2, someone says to me, and they seem to think upon it fondly. So there you are.
They often regret that their sons and now daughters don't have to suffer the way they felt they suffered in Science 1-2 and English 1-2. Bruce, when he came, was finishing up his graduate work at Yale and was brought again by Ted Soller to Amherst, along with a very well-known physicist, William Fairbank. to help Ted build a helium liquefier at the college. And Amherst, for many years, was one of the few institutions in the United States that had its own helium liquefier. But the original purpose for which the liquefier was built was to try to isolate what is known as helium-3, an isotope of helium, and study its properties. And Bruce's task was to build a mass spectrometer to carry out that isolation process. But about the time that this happened, helium-3 became relatively abundant because of the hydrogen bomb project. And so the interest in that research shifted. And it was Arnold Ahrens, I think, who persuaded Bruce to turn his expertise in mass spectroscopy to studying ocean currents.
Yes.
Do you remember anything about that?
Not very much. I do remember that that was so. And it led to a very interesting, development and a great deal of work by Bruce over the years in building this laboratory, the mass spectrometer. And he worked at that for many years. I got a little bit, not conversant with, but a little bit acquainted with it because I used to help Bruce do various things around the machine, especially fill it with liquid nitrogen, which it had to be done on a regular basis. And when he was busy doing things, I would go over to the physics lab late at night in the old physics lab, Fairweather Hall, down in the basement, which where his lab was, and fill that machine. And then I continued to do it when the science building was built. And it was sort of eerie running around that building in the midnight or so, but I got used to doing that. I sort of enjoyed doing that. It was kind of fun. I was always worried about, making a mistake and doing the wrong thing. Really worried. But,
well, bet.
but wouldn't want to do the wrong thing for a lot of reasons. But at any rate, I managed not to make any mistakes.
I was going to raise this point later in our discussion, but I'll raise it now. In this matter of filling what were called Bruce's traps with liquid nitrogen twice each day, at least that's how I remember it, there came a time just after we had moved from Fairweather to Merrill Science Center after it had been built, when there was a sit-in at the college. In February 1970, there was a sit-in by the black students of Merrill and Converse and Frost and another building, Converse, I guess.
This was after the move from Fairweather?
After the move from Fairweather. And that sit-in lasted for less than 24 hours, but the traps had to be filled every 12 hours. And I remember going to the building and trying to persuade the students to let Bruce in so he could fill the traps. And they, in my view, somewhat grudgingly agreed. So we arranged for him to enter Merrill by a back door where it wouldn't be seen easily from the rest of the campus. And Bruce went in, and actually in that case, since we didn't know how long the sit-in was going to last, he turned off the pumps rather than refilling them with nitrogen so that mercury vapors wouldn't get into the building. And Bruce was quoted in the Amherst Student after that sit-in as saying that as he left the building, he thanked the students and he said, they were very gracious.
Sounds like Bruce.
It does, it does. Let's turn back to the league. You mentioned that you were, if I've got the dates correctly, you were president of the Town League of Amherst. And while you were doing that, you were also on the state board for a while?
Yes, let's see. The dates get a little difficult. I believe that yes, I became local league president about 1957 and went on the state board at the same time. And so, and then I became president of the state league in 1961, I think.
Mm-hmm. I have it written here.
Oh. and that until 1964, and then I was on the national board. By that time, I became president in 1968.
Now, one among the facts that I noted while trying to prepare for this little was that when you were president, national president, you had a constituency of 170,000 members.
Right, yeah.
And I tried to calculate back about that time, I should think that a member of the House of Representatives from Nevada or Wyoming or such states had a smaller constituency than that.
Well, maybe. However, our functions were quite different.
uh, you told me the other day a nice story about Henry Steele Commager and the League.
Oh, well, in 1974, as I was concluding my third term as National League president, we had our convention in San Francisco. And I asked Henry Steele Commager if he would come out and speak to the League convention, and yes, he would. And we paid his transportation, but he did not receive nor even expect an honorarium. He got out there to discover that we had just changed the bylaws of the League of Women Voters to admit men, and this had been quite a controversy, but it was passed easily. He got there and he said, "Oh, you've admitted men. I want to be the first member." And I said, "Well, Felix, you can't be the first member." "Why not?" he said. And I said, "Because Bruce is already the first member." "Oh," he said. "Well, that's all right. He's my colleague." That was very nice.
In that period, I think when you were state president, I noted that you were also a Radcliffe Fellow.
That was before I was state president. That was, I believe, from 1955 to 57.
I thought I recorded it slightly later, but at any rate, can you tell us a bit about?
Well, I got what the purpose was to do a study of religion and politics in Massachusetts and the influence of one upon the other. And I didn't get very far with it because I got so involved in several big efforts by the League at making some changes in Massachusetts state government. And but that's what I was doing at Radcliffe.
Did you commute to Radcliffe at the time?
Oh, yeah, I commuted to Radcliffe and to Boston to be in my work in the League at the same time.
Let's turn back to Amherst Town and Amherst
Okay.
College a little bit. In those early years, and I think later as well, you served on various town committees. Were a town meeting member.
I was a town meeting member for 17 years, I think it was. I was a town finance committee member from 1960 to 66, I think it was. For 6 years, those 6 years, which was very interesting. I really enjoyed that. It was a little bit, not really like, but a little bit like being on an audit committee, where you really learn everything that's going on and why things cost what they cost and why you have to do this, that, or the other thing. I enjoyed it immensely.
So it was good preparation for later
Right.
aspects of your career.
Well, that's true. Yes, it certainly was not unfamiliar. What I ran into later was not unfamiliar. It was not the same, but the finance committee does a different thing from what an audit committee does, so that they're not the same. But the atmosphere is the same, one might say. The surroundings, the work that you have to do is related.
What about town meeting in those days? Was it as contentious then and as long-winded as it apparently is now?
No, it was not contentious and it was not long-winded, and we had a simply super town moderator who was one of the leading citizens of the town, Winthrop Dakin, and he was a tall and distinguished-looking person who presided over the town meeting with a great deal of aplomb and quiet organization. And he would say, when the discussion on an article had gone on what he considered to be long enough, "Does anybody have anything new to say?" And you wouldn't have gotten up and said anything at all unless it really was new. And that made town meeting moved along considerably faster than it does now.
Oh, for a good moderator.
Right. Well, and also it's a different time now. You know, there was not. We've gone through a whole period of participatory democracy, and everybody needs to be heard, quote, end quote, and that takes a lot of time.
You mentioned earlier Gail Kennedy and Gail Kennedy's, I don't remember his wife's name.
Joy Kennedy was her name.
And you also you mentioned briefly Colston Warren.
Yes.
It's interesting. when I told my father that I had accepted a faculty position at Amherst, all he knew about Amherst was that Colston Warren was here.
That's interesting.
Did you know the Warrens well?
Yes, did know them quite well. Yeah, we knew them quite well.
There were several eminent members of the economics department at that time.
That's
Willard Thorpe, for example.
Willard Thorpe,
and his wife Clarice.
Right.
Did you, over the years, have much connection?
Oh, yes, knew them very well. And knew Clarice and Willard Thorpe very well. We spent a good deal of time with them over the years. And they were invigorating people, interesting.
And as you look back over the people you knew at Amherst at that time, you obviously knew Charlie Cole,
Yes.
Cal Plimpton, who followed.
Right.
Their wives.
Right.
There are other people who loomed large at that time. Certainly when I was here, Al Lumley.
Oh, yes.
Could you say a bit about Al Lumley?
Oh, Al Lumley was a wonderful person. He was the track coach,
Right.
and but he also dabbled in real estate, and he was responsible for us buying the house that we bought. We were looking around for a place to. We lived in Webster House on the corner of South Pleasant and Webster Street. I forget now what the name of that street is. Doesn't matter.
Isn't it Walnut in
I
Webster?
don't know. Doesn't matter. Anyway, and it was a 4-room apartment, and we wanted to move, and we were too low on the totem pole to qualify for a what one might call a good house owned by the college. So we started to look for a place to live, and we found a place in Hadley we thought we wanted to live in. Thank God we didn't. But and Bruce had Al Lumley come look at the house, and he found that it was not suitable. It was not a good place to buy. So he scouted around and came up with the house which we subsequently bought, which was then owned by Paul French, who owned the bookstore downtown. And they had built a house, he and his wife had built a house up in Harkness Road in Pelham. And so Al Lumley persuaded them to sell us the house for half price. And we had a second mortgage on that. This was another whole story. The college had just passed a new procedure called a second mortgage. And this was to encourage faculty members to go out and buy their own house. I don't think we knew about this when we started, but we were the first to come under it. And we went down to the Amherst Savings Bank, which is now where the restaurant Chez Albert is, and Mr. Hawley, who was a very elderly, distinguished-looking gentleman, the bank president, and Paul Weathers, who was the college treasurer, and to sign this second mortgage. And we already had a first mortgage with the bank, a different bank, First National Bank of Amherst, in fact, no longer in existence. And we were reading this agreement between us and the college, which we were to sign, when I came upon a paragraph which said that if something happened to Bruce, I would have to pay up the mortgage in full or be out of the house in 6 months. And I read that, and I said, "Is that what that means?" And Paul Weathers said, "Well, yes, of course, as if it were naturally." And I said, "Well, I won't sign." Well, all hell broke loose, and Bruce said he wouldn't sign, and Toby Dakin said I would not advise signing that, and that was that. And so overnight, however, Charlie Cole, who was down at Columbia University on on business, he made it clear that this had to go through, and so the paragraph got taken out, and the next morning we met and signed the thing, and there we were. It was a bit of a flurry in the faculty, I might say.
It's a very lovely house now. Was it as lovely then?
Oh, just about. It basically is still the same. We've changed around some of the inside, but mostly it's the same. Trees, all the trees around the place Bruce planted. That is to say, he had planted, and they were very small then. Now, of course, they're towering trees.
And he chose them?
Oh, he chose them indeed, yes. Bruce was very good at not horticulture, but at trees anyway. Trees and bushes, yeah.
You mentioned Toby Dakin.
Yeah.
The Dakins were an eminent family
Indeed.
in the town, in the history of the town. And Janet
Dakin, yes.
Janet Dakin, was she an animal lover at that time as well as?
Oh, I think so,
later on?
because she was a horse person. And had horses then, and rode all the time. And I don't think I don't remember that they had a dog. They may have had cats. I've forgotten now. But she was certainly an animal person.
And also a league person.
Oh, yes, and a league person. Yes, very much so.
So
She was not only a member of the league and a local league president, but when I became state president, she became our parliamentarian at state conventions. And then when I became national president, she became the parliamentarian at our national conventions. She was terrific, just wonderful. And everybody loved her because when they wanted to do something, she enabled them to do it or said, no, you can't do that. The way to do it is this way. And people who were trying to do things at the convention, trying to get things changed or passed or what have you, counted on her to give them the best advice as to how to maneuver. And she was very good, yeah. And a great sense of humor. Everybody loved her.
What other interesting and eminent people did you meet in those years at Amherst?
At Amherst?
Well, or elsewhere, but
well, you know, that's
before we move on to your larger career.
I can't remember just exactly. You know, one meets a lot of people in politics when you're working on things having to do with government, and so you know you get used to meeting and working with governors and legislators, and I was on a number of committees or commissions of the in the state while I was state league president. One in particular was a commission made up of several legislators. The Senate president, whose name was Donahue, was the chairman, and there were three public members: George Ellis, who was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and Polly Bunting, who was president of Radcliffe, and yours truly. And we were charged with exploring the problems of governance of the University of Massachusetts, and which was very closely tied to the entire state personnel and budget system. In other words, it was just another department operating out of the State House, which was impossible. You know, having Personnel Bureau of the state deciding who should be hired to be a professor of physics. They didn't know anything about physics or about academics or anything else. Anyway, we recommended, and it subsequently got adopted by the legislature, that the trustees of the University of Massachusetts be freed of the state control agencies and have their own personnel bureau and their own everything. And what they had to do, of course, was still get their budget passed by the legislature. They weren't freed of that, but it was it gave birth to the growth of the University of Massachusetts, which has been spectacular. And that was under the presidency of John Letterly, who came from the University of Michigan late in the 50s, I guess, to the university. Very good man. That was very interesting and a great deal of work. It was a great battle in the legislature, but it's always fun to win.
I really had never appreciated your role in the changes in the university.
Well, it was. I've always felt a little bit of. I continue to feel a little bit of proprietary interest in the university because of that. You know. Other than that, I've no connection.
Well, you've had a connection of importance with both the Amherst College and the university. What about Hampshire? Was Bruce?
No, we weren't really involved with the founding of Hampshire. I did speak at a Hampshire commencement once, but other than that, we weren't involved. And though, of course, we knew everybody who was. I knew I think his name was Peterson, who came from Tufts. Mm-hmm. And I knew Chuck Longsworth at Amherst and Ken Rosenthal, who were involved in the very beginning of Hampshire.
Did Bruce ever express views about the Hampshire curriculum?
I don't remember. I don't really remember that.
Before we move on to other aspects of your career, let me ask you about matters pertaining to women in academic institutions and elsewhere. You knew Jill Conway.
Oh, yes, very well. I was on the trustees. I was a member of the trustees of Smith College when she was president.
And you had some disagreements with her, is that right?
No, not really. We didn't have any disagreements about um, anything except a disagreement in philosophy about whether or not Smith should stay a same gender college, and I thought it ought not to, but it was not a popular thing. Well, it was very popular among some members of the faculty wanted the college to be co-ed, but others did not, and it was not a subject which we discussed at the Board of Trustees, and she would not have allowed it to be discussed. But it was much on my mind. And before I left, and as an outgoing trustee, I made a speech about it at the trustees meeting, and that was that. It's still a single-sex educational institution.
But somewhat different now. I mean, it's had great success, I gather, with this new engineering program.
I guess yes. It's done a lot of things, and I think I don't feel quite as strongly about the issue as I used to. I still think it's better for both men and women to be in college together than not. But can't battle windmills.
Another strong woman who has been in the Valley in our time here was Catherine Benson.
Oh, yes.
Did you know her at all?
No, I didn't know her very well. I knew her a little bit. I knew her mother.
Oh, really?
Yeah, years and years ago, she came to see, or she asked me to come to see her at the American Museum of Natural History about, she wanted to talk about voting and how native peoples like the Samoans might be getting into voting. I don't really remember that at all. It was a little bit ethereal, the conversation. What I do remember, however, was her office. At the American Museum of Natural History. It was way up, it's a crenellated building and has round towers, and it looks like a great fortress in New York City. I remember climbing up to her office at the last step to get to her office was a ladder. I don't think I could do that today, but that was a very long time ago.
You have long favored coeducation.
Yeah.
What about the women's movement?
Well, the women's movement was, it was good, and it was a fine thing. I don't know really how to answer that question. What about
well, not asked very well. But I know you have strong feelings about certain kinds of programs in academia, women's studies, women's and gender studies.
I never have quite understood women's and gender studies, and I still don't. But then I must say, I have not made an effort to try to understand it. I don't know why you have a women's studies and you don't have a men's studies myself. But, I'm sure that I don't know that I want anybody around here to hear that. I'll probably get assassinated or something.
Well, we'll leave it there then.
Well, let me just say about the women's movement. The women's movement was a very good thing. It freed up and opened doors that had not been open before, and one can just look back 20 years and now and see the difference in what women are doing and what they think of themselves and what they expect of themselves. Altogether, a very good and positive movement. There were some crazy things that went on, of course, but that's bound to happen in any movement before it settles down. I think the women's movement is a very good thing.
And I heard you last week very strongly praise Gloria Steinem. Op-ed piece.
Yes, she recently wrote an op-ed piece about the presidential campaign and Senator Obama and Senator Clinton, and it was a very reasonable thing, pointing out that both women and men have made the greatest strides when they were, women and black people, white women and black people, or black women, have made the greatest strides when they move ahead together and not when they fight each other. And way back in the very beginning of the women's movement, suffrage movement, the women gave up the fighting for suffrage. This is a period of history I'm not very familiar with, but at any rate, the women gave up the big fight for suffrage in order to get the Constitution amended to allow black men to vote. So that's a long history of a beginning history of women, but that's a complicated era.
When I think about it, I realize I've never thought this through before, but were there many black women at Smith when you were a student?
Oh, no. I believe there were 2 in our class. One of them went on to work for Time magazine and is now retired. And I'm trying to remember about the other one. I've now forgotten what she did. Oh, no, she teaches. Teaches in Philadelphia, but she's also retired.
And what about in the league?
There were some league members, black members, but not an awful lot. But there were the number. There were 2 on the national board when I was national president. I don't believe we had a black woman on the state board. We tried, but it was as it continues to be a difficult thing to get these people together. But it's easier now than it was, because more and more women have gone into the same fields, like law, for instance, and so they're together in law school, and they're together in law practice, for instance, and they're likely to end up being together doing other things.
You know Marion Wright Edelman fairly
yes,
well,
I do
and her
know her
husband.
quite well. Yeah.
Did that come out of the league years, or did it come out of
I
the
guess
Washington years?
it came out of the league years first, and then followed Peter Edelman. Well, they were still very much around, and still are very much around. During the time I was league president, and we were working on issues having to do with children and welfare, for instance.
Let's turn again to your career, particularly after you left the league.
Mm-hmm.
You were Secretary of Human Services in Massachusetts from 1975 to 76. What were the challenges there?
Well, I don't know exactly what the department is like now, but at that time, it included almost the whole of the state's expenditures except education, mental health, public health, welfare, juvenile matters, prisons. All of those departments were under the Office of Human Services. So there was a lot to do, a lot to learn. The deficit of the state at the time was fairly large. I can't remember what it was, but the governor was very impressed by the size of the deficit, and he wanted the budgets cut. And he had very strong feelings about how things should be run. And I will have to say, in all fairness, that he didn't know much about what he was talking, as a matter of fact. You can only cut staff at a mental hospital or a public health hospital just so much. You end up not having anybody on duty at night, and that can be very dangerous. And that was ultimately what led me to resign. And I just thought it was not responsible to do that. And you can cut a budget, you can cut 10%, you could even cut another 10%, but you can't do it a third time. It just won't go. Not across the board. Some things you can cut more, but you can't cut staff out of hospitals, not nursing staff. So we came to an agreement, and I resigned, and that was that.
And have you had much contact with him in later years?
Every once in a while I see him, and it's all very, very friendly and nice, and that was a long time ago.
Then, if I've got it right, from 76 to 77, you were on a special commission that had to do with the governance of the House. Have I got that right?
Yes, it was a committee set up by it was enacted into law by the House of Representatives to study the administration of the House of Representatives. There have been a lot of ferment over the past few years then, in the early 70s, particularly caused by a member of Congress from Missouri named Richard Bowling, who wrote a book. I've forgotten just what the name of it was. I think it was House Out of Order. And he was trying very hard to get the House to reform itself and to adopt practices which were more let's say less grounded in what they used to do and more grounded in what they needed to do in order to meet the challenges of the modern world, the House of Representatives. And I was appointed to that committee and was really looking forward to it. Been to a couple of meetings before the election of that year, 76, when President Carter was elected, and I was happily at home just around Christmas time, getting ready for the family to arrive and doing some cooking when the phone rang one morning about 8:15. "Lucy, this is Cyrus Vance." And I was not expecting a call from Cyrus Vance, and he wanted me, he said, to come down to Washington and be Undersecretary of State, and for security assistance. And I said, "What is that?" I didn't even know what that was. Military exports is what it was, and nuclear non-proliferation. Here I am, back to physics again. And so I couldn't come down. I said I couldn't come down. I was cooking, and he said, "Well, come down right after Christmas." So I went down to see him, and ended up, of course, taking that position, and for 3 years. It was very, very interesting, just full of interesting things.
Now, you had known Cyrus Vance, obviously, earlier.
Right.
Were you active in the Council on Foreign Relations before?
No, not then. I wasn't. I was a member of the Trilateral Commission, which had gotten started in the early 70s by David Rockefeller and a number of other eminent people, some of whom I knew, to get the northern industrial democracies together to work together. That is, Europe, U.S. and Canada and Japan, on common economic and common problems of all kinds. Fascinating, really was very interesting. And so that's where I met Cyrus Vance. And I had met Jimmy Carter when we had a National League convention in Atlanta in 1970. No, 72. And so I knew him also. He was a very fine host to the League when we were there, some 1,500 delegates from all over the country, and he made life very, very easy for us. He was, a welcoming governor and involved in what we were doing, and that was a great thing. Anyway, so that's how I knew him.
It was when you accepted your appointment as Undersecretary?
Right.
He was going to kiss you on the cheek or something.
Oh, did I? That may well be, and I stuck out my hand instead. That I've given that up now.
But kissing on the cheek has now come back.
Now men are kissing men on the cheek. I mean, it's kind of silly. Shaking a hand is perfectly adequate. Yeah.
You met some interesting people during your tenure as Undersecretary of State. The
Shah, yes, and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the President of Slovenia, and not Yugoslavia then, though it was just breaking up at that point, and a number of other people. The King of Morocco. You meet all these people, and it all happens so fast. You just sort of, I'd even forgotten about it until this session we came up and began to think about what I had done, and you ask questions, and that that reminds me of things, and otherwise I wouldn't have remembered. But it's true.
Especially in the Middle East, I would have thought that being a woman might have been particularly difficult at times. Was that the case?
Well, it didn't turn out to be. I would have thought it might be too, and I was a little astonished that I got sent off to Saudi Arabia, and much less to Iran. That was a different situation, or to other places. But I don't know, either the way was paved very carefully ahead of time, or it was just simply assumed. And since it was assumed, it was assumed. I don't know. I do think that the reason that the appointment with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, which was very interesting and fun, but did not take place until midnight in the palace. I think it must have been so that nobody would see me going in or coming out. The few people who knew that there was a woman in there with a crown prince, the better, I suppose. I wasn't alone, of course. Our ambassador was with me, and various of the crown prince's retinue were there, and we talked for well over an hour. It was really sort of fun. Our ambassador, who was a wonderful man from former governor of South Carolina named John West, fondly known in the State Department as the Swamp Fox, because he was so one of those enormously able political people who can get things done. Just wonderful to watch. He had told me there'd be no smoking with the Crown Prince. I said, "Well, all right, I won't smoke." Crown Prince comes in, sits down, great robes all over the place, And pretty soon out comes a pack of cigarettes and a lighter, and he smokes that, and then he smokes another one. The third time he said, "Would you like a cigarette?" And I could hardly repress a smile. I did. I mean, I did, but I thanked him very much, took a cigarette, and for the rest of the time we were there, we both smoked all the time. And now that I've given up smoking years and years ago, I look back on that with some wonderment. But in any case, we had a very good talk. I had been sent over there to tell him something, and I did, and he took that aboard, and then he gave me a lecture in the world events and the realities of the world seen from his point of view. I don't now remember what that was, but it was very interesting.
Did the realities, do you recall, did the realities as he saw them correlate with the realities that you saw?
Not too far apart, but it's just, he's coming from a different background, a different point of view, and he saw things in the Middle East, I think, I'm not quite sure how to put that, somewhat differently from the way we saw it. And in other words, his world was there, and our world is here. So I don't know that I can be any more specific than that.
When you went to visit him, did you go as a woman of the West, or were you attired?
Went as a woman of the West on my regular business attire, and there was some conversation about that. I guess it was the first time any woman had been over in these parts for the State Department. That didn't occur to me at the time, but the subject about what I should wear came up early in the day that we were there, and I said, I'm not going to wear one of those things. I don't have one, won't wear one. And the men were discussing this, including the ambassador. And I got up, and the ambassador's wife was in the kitchen, and I said, what do you think about this? She said, of course not. You wear what you normally wear. And I went back and I said, conversation closed. I am not going to change my clothes. I'm going to wear what I normally would wear, period. It was all right. It was the end, it was the end, it was a not what I would call an earth-shaking conversation. And once I just put my foot down, that was the end. There was no point in pursuing it.
And then I think you served as an interlocutor or a peacemaker between the president of Rwanda and Diane Fossey. Is that right?
It's tried, yes. That was toward the end of my tenure in the State Department. The government of Rwanda was having a very hard time coping with the problems created by Diane Fossey with her research station on the mountain, great mountain gorillas, gorgeous creatures. And she wanted everybody to stay away from, she wanted a larger and larger area for the gorillas to inhabit, which I could perfectly well understand. But he was having trouble with the farmers in the area who wanted land to farm on. And Diane was not a peacemaker. she wanted it her way, and so I was the government of Rwanda appealed to the State Department to help with this problem, and I was sent over by Cyrus Vance to see what I could do, and it was a most interesting experience, I must say. Her camp was, I don't remember how far up that mountain, but it was a damn long way, at least 9,000 feet. And we didn't start at ground zero, but we started partway up, and it took about, my recollection is it took about 4 or 5 hours to get up there, and I thought to myself, I was terrified I wouldn't make it, and I'd disgrace the government of the U.S. and disgrace myself, but I made it. And 9/10 of the way up, the native trackers who were carrying all the stuff up there, up the mountain to her place and leading the way, got word that there was a group of gorillas off the trail a little bit. So we literally crawled through the bushes. It was by this time pouring rain. And there was an opening, a group of gorillas. I never saw anything like that in my life. It was the most exciting thing. We sat down on the ground in the rain, and my camera, I had given my other bag to the ambassador's wife to carry for me, and it had the extra film in it, and so I only had 7 pictures in that roll of film. And sitting there, and there were at least 2 mothers and 2 little babies. I remember them specifically because one of them came over and sat on my leg, and I thought I'd die, and really wanted to reach out and pat that little thing, but of course I didn't move. I barely breathed. Because because I was so afraid of doing something that would frighten them. But they were a group of gorillas who were used to human beings. They were one of Diane Fossey's study groups. And then there were a couple of very large, what are called silverbacks, the big males, and a bunch of youngsters, whom I call teenagers, running around causing trouble. And one of the silverbacks made a sound. Everybody was quiet. With some sound they all knew, and that was cut it out and shut up. It was miraculous. And anyway, so then after spending about a half hour watching the gorillas, we went on up to the camp, and which was quite an extraordinary place, really. A mixture of very modern and very unmodern. No modern plumbing, for instance. And she said, "I'm giving you my bed to sleep in tonight, but you'll have to sleep with my dog." It was a very nice dog, a Labrador Retriever of some sort, and it was just fine. It was all right with me. and let's see, she and I had very extended discussions, and I can't say that it got anywhere. She did, however, subsequently work with the government more closely, and then not too long after that, she was murdered in a murder that's never really been solved, and but that research camp is still going on. But that was quite an experience.
Before we leave your years with the State Department, I wanted to ask you about a couple of people, some of whom you may have met after those years. I'm not quite certain, but can you say a little bit more about Cy Vance?
Oh,
both as a person and as a diplomat.
Well, in both terms, a person and a diplomat. He was a very, very fine person, and there was a lot of tension in the department, or between the department, and it's not unusual, between the State Department and the National Security Advisor. And Cy Vance and Zbig Brzezinski did not see eye to eye on a lot of things, so there was an undertow of that going on all the time, but actually did not involve me very much, and except as a side, on the sidelines, knowing about disagreements and difficulties. But he was a very fine guy. He was also a very fine diplomat, and in the end, he resigned over that not too long after I left the State Department, over that business of the attempt to rescue the hostages in Iran, which was so badly planned, and but he was a very nice man as well as a very fine diplomat.
Well, now I've forgotten. I mean, he was obviously not involved in the technical aspects of that operation. Was he opposed to the attempt?
He was opposed to, I believe, I'm not sure whether he was opposed to the attempt altogether or just the way in which it was run. I think he was opposed to the attempt, period. But the main thing was that it just wasn't going to work. And I heard about it before it happened, just by chance. And I said to the person who told me, I didn't know that this was going to be, what he was telling me was what's going to be going on. I said, you haven't got enough helicopters. And they may not have had other things, but they certainly didn't have enough helicopters. And, of course, it was a terrible, god-awful failure. And anyway, but Vance was a wonderful person. He was very, very good.
My recollection of that time was he was, in a sense, the dove, and Brzezinski was the hawk.
Yes, I think that would be accurate.
These days, Brzezinski, the current climate is something of a dove.
That's right. Yeah.
Did you know him at all?
Yes,
well, at that time, and in the
I knew him, and I still know him, but I wouldn't say I really know him well.
But has he changed, or is it that the times have changed?
I think that you never know, really, whether people change or not. I think that the situation is different. We're not talking about going in and rescuing hostages. We're talking about invading. Well, that's what we call it. The president calls it something else. And he's bringing freedom to Iraq, but, that's... we were not engaged in bringing freedom to other countries in those days the way this administration has been engaged in that, or what they say that's what they're doing. And I think that the whole atmosphere of this administration would be counter to anything that Brzezinski thought was a good way to go.
A couple of other names, Jim Woolsey and Paul Wolfowitz.
Well,
Were they around Washington at the time that you
yes,
were in the State
yeah, I
Department?
knew them. Woolsey at the time, no, after I was in the State Department, Woolsey was, though he was a Defense Department person, he was made ambassador to Indonesia, and I met him at that time when he was ambassador to Indonesia. I think that's the first I knew of him. Woolsey, I knew. He was in the Defense Department, I believe, or he may not even have been in government, but I did know him at that time. He may have been one of those people who works outside of the government, but I believe that he was in the Defense Department. And I knew him then and subsequently, not well, but I knew him.
Were the policies they later advocated, could they have been anticipated on the basis of the way the policies they favored at the time?
So long ago, I'm not sure I know.
Or Cheney, Dick Cheney and
Cheney,
and
I'm
Rumsfeld
not.
must have been around then too.
Cheney and who?
Oh,
And Rumsfeld. Yeah,
Rumsfeld.
right. I knew Rumsfeld also, and I didn't know Cheney very well, but I was not ever surprised at Cheney. He's been a quite consistent person ever since he was in the Congress, where he voted against Head Start because we couldn't afford it. You know, takes a certain amount of mindset, which never changed, I'm sure. Woolsey, I'm not sure about, and I'm not surprised about Wolfowitz. He was his later years are consistent with his earlier years, I think. Yeah.
Changing the terms of the discussion a little bit, in those Washington years and other years when you were away from Amherst a good part of the time, how did you and Bruce carry on?
Oh, well, it wasn't hard. We talked on the phone every night at great length, and he would tell me what was going on at Amherst and the college and the department and the building of the science building or whatever it was, and students and interesting things, and I would tell him what I had been doing, and sometimes I had problems. I'd talk them over with him. You know, it was an expensive telephone conversation, but I was gone normally 3 days a week. Well, no, as the State Department, I was gone longer. I was gone from Monday morning till Friday evening in the State Department, and when I had to travel, I was gone more than that, over a weekend, let's just say. But then I would normally come home after most of those years, 3 days, and so I was here 4 days, and which was plenty of time to do all the errands that needed to be done, and take care of the dogs. And we did have people in the house helping Bruce, and when I went in the State Department, before then he was on his own.
In many of those conversations, Bruce was in the lab taking data, was he, at that time? Or
it was mostly home, I think, when we talked on the telephone. I would call him after 11 o'clock.
okay.
Yeah. I forget why. I think the telephone rates were cheaper after 11, weren't they? I think.
Probably.
I think so, yeah.
Actually, to backtrack even a little more, even further into the past, there were those years of the late 60s and the early 70s. The college had closed down effectively
yes,
for
right.
a couple of days at a time. There was the sit-in at Westover. There was the
And the president of the college was in the front row of the sit-in, as
right,
it were. Yeah.
Right. We had long debates in the faculty about whether or not the college, or the faculty at any rate, should adopt public positions. The Vietnamese War. Where did Bruce come down on those issues?
Do you remember talking with him about it? My recollection is that he was on the conservative side, that he was not convinced that the college should take this action or get involved in demonstrations and things like that.
Not that he expressed approval for the
No.
for the war itself.
No.
But for the
but for the action of an institution, an academic institution. I think he was. I'm not sure he was flat out against it, but he wasn't really in favor of it. He didn't think it was appropriate. It was not the right role for the college to be playing. It was all right for the students to demonstrate, but not for the leaders of the college or the faculty.
Yeah, those are my impressions as well. We don't have to proceed in a logical fashion, so let me digress and mention a couple of things about Bruce. Bruce was born in 1922, and his name is Bruce Buzzell Benson.
That's right.
He
was born
B cubed.
B cubed. That's right. I still, when I write his name, I still write B cubed. He was born on 2/22/22.
Right.
His father, I am told, was breathless, hoping that he would make it.
Oh, I wondered
on
about
22.
that.
Yeah.
And was the decision on the name made after the birth date?
That I don't know. But Buzzell was his mother's maiden name, and I don't know where the rest of his father's name, of course, is Benson. I don't know where the Bruce came from. Oh, yes, one of his father's brothers was named Bruce, and I think he was named after Uncle Bruce, who lived in California. Yeah.
Apparently, Dan and Bruce were having a conversation about numerology one day, and Bruce mentioned that he was 2222,
Yeah,
etc.
right.
And I think he thought Dan should be impressed, but Dan tells me he was not impressed at all, and in fact, his mother was 10-10-10, and was
1910, I suppose so. Yeah.
and grew up on a farm, which Dan regards as highly significant, since 10-10-10 is a kind of fertilizer.
Oh, that's right. Well.
Actually, in talking about Bruce and Bruce's research, when Bruce went into mass spectrometry and oceanography, he did work which is widely quoted, widely valued still. But one of the things I didn't realize is that some of the early work was analyzing the solubility of various gases in seawater.
Mm-hmm.
And the origin, or the reasons for doing this, was that the solubilities of gases in liquids and fluids depends upon the temperature. And by measuring the isotopic content of various gases dissolved in seawater, one can learn about what is known as paleotemperatures, to use Dan's term, of the water mass. And what they were really trying to do was to determine temperature changes in the environment.
Mm-hmm.
This was in the 50s and 60s, early 70s, much of this work. But it strikes me as interesting. It was a study ahead of its time because, of course, these are now contemporary concerns of much greater immediate importance.
Right.
It's interesting, at that time, they were concerned, or at least there was a hypothesis, that the environment was cooling rather than warming, which is one of the reasons that the warming these days is so striking.
Mm-hmm.
Bruce went on, actually, in his research, and toward the end of his life, he was studying the structure of water,
Mm-hmm.
which is in a way a kind of a funny concept, since it's a liquid and doesn't,
Right.
one would think doesn't have a structure. But he was studying the structure by looking at the solubilities of various gases in water. And also, I learned only in the last few years that he did some similar work on geological specimens,
Mm-hmm.
Which was pointed out to me by Peter Crowley.
Peter Crowley, yes.
So Bruce's work was of importance at the time and remains.
Interesting, isn't it?
Still to be important.
Really very nice.
I wanted to get that in.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to your career. Life after the State Department.
Well, let's see.
We're up to 1980 or so.
Up to night, yes. Well, you know, I that was kind of at the point when corporations and organizations which had not normally had women on their boards began to think this might not be a bad idea. and I got first asked to go on the board of Northeast Utilities, which is the main utility of this area, which was very interesting, and first-rate chairman of the board named Lee Sillen. And then I got asked to be on various other boards, and including Federated Department Stores and the Continental Can Company, and so for the next some years I was on a number of boards, and which takes quite a lot of time. It's not People talk all the time about how corporate boards are just sit around and do nothing, but we worked hard, and and I was on a number of nonprofit boards as well, and mostly having to do in the foreign policy field. And so I was really very busy all that time. I'm still busy. I don't know quite why I'm so busy, but I am.
Were there differences in what you did, or atmospheres on elite boards of colleges or boards of philanthropic groups versus boards of corporate boards?
Well, I guess college board. I was on the board of Lafayette College for 15 years. That was brought about by Bruce's classmate Harry Keefe, who was a large benefactor of Amherst College, the class of '43, and Harry was on that board because he got involved with the board of Lafayette when his son went there, and they were looking for women to be on their board. They'd gone co-ed, but their women graduates were still too young to be, have enough experience to be on a board, and so Harry asked me. Well, he called up Bruce and said, "Would you ask Lucy if she would be on the board of Lafayette College?" And he said, "You ask Lucy yourself." Well, I ended up going on the board, and it was a most interesting time to be on that board. There was a marvelous chairman named Larry Raymer, who comes from Los Angeles, and he was just determined to raise the academic level of the college, and we did do that in the course of those years. It's quite a good institution and really first rate. But one gets to know, it's more intense on a at least that was more intense on that college board, because we met 4 times a year, and that's not so often, but somehow it's a more, not quite sure how to put it, it's more with you all the time than being on a corporate board, unless you've got some big problem on a corporate board. And there were times when there were some big problems of management types or government contract types or audit problems that really get very intense and you get very involved. It's not a hands-off, it's not a spectator sport being on a board.
Well, you're on the board of, or chairman of the board, I think, of the Amherst
Cinema Arts Center. Right.
How does that contrast or compare
Well,
with some of these other?
It's more or less the same kind. It's an entirely different scene, of course. Cinema, film, all that sort of stuff. Very different from insurance or department stores or what have you, or packaging. But it is the same. The boards of directors have a fiduciary responsibility for the financial welfare of the organization. You're responsible for that. It's a legal thing, not just an organizational thing. And the problems you have personnel issues, you have budget problems, you have audit problems. It's really not all that different. What's different is movies. How do you get movies? Who decides what movie comes to which theater? Distributors do. I've learned that. And you have a hard time, if you're a small theater, getting the really big movies because you don't have that much audience. And so the more screens you have, we have 3, and we will now have availability of 2 more since the Northampton Pleasant Street Theater is going to be has raised enough money, and we're going to help them run their show. So now we'll have 5 screens between the 2 of us, and this will enable us to have bigger and more the most in-demand films. Anyway, that sort of thing goes on all the time. You worry about money, and you worry about raising money. We are still raising money to pay for the building of the theater, and we've started off with $2.6 million to raise. We're down to $100,000. That's pretty exciting. And the last 100,000 is probably going to be terribly hard to raise. But in any case, we're doing very well financially. the movie house is.
And now that you're back in Amherst, do you spend more time with the league, the local league?
No, not really. You know, I go to some events, and I see them from time to time, but I don't go. I don't know. I'm a bit in and out. I'm not really involved. I don't want to be involved. It's, you know, a long time ago. But I get asked to do things, and if I can, I do them.
So, the future.
Well,
What do you look forward to a more peaceful time, a more restful time, or
I look forward, if you want to know, to a better administration of this country. Wouldn't have to be very much better to be better. I think this administration has been a disaster for a lot of reasons. There's no point in going into them now, but I would hope to have a Democrat in the White House the next time, and a democratically, not necessarily overwhelmingly controlled Congress, but one with a workable majority where the tyranny of the minority does not take place as it is now taking place. I'm very concerned about our government and about our public sphere, and about the ability of human beings to run their lives in a somewhat sensible fashion, rational fashion. Can't have, you know, we'll never achieve total rationality because people are not totally rational. So just hope for the best. That's what I hope for. That keeps me very busy because I'm very involved in watching what's going on both in the world and in the country and in the town, and
in the college.
And in the college too. It takes a lot of time keeping up with.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.